Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, September 20th, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, the Mad Fermentationist, Michael Tonsmeire, joins us in the first of a two-parter on Offbeat yeasts. Mike's been doing some experimenting with non-traditional fermenting critters, and he sent us some samples for us to sample. In fact, he sent so many that we're breaking up the tasting into two parts, this week and next week. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. If you haven't checked it out yet, check out the latest episode of Basic Brewing Video, where Steve and I put on our science hats and skunk some beers for the cause. I think it's one of my favorite episodes of Basic Brewing Video, and I'd like to know what you think. It's just, okay, it makes me smile just to think about it. But anyway, if you want to know about the skunking process, you can see it in action. Just go to basicbrewingvideo.com, and you can see a flash version right there on the site. Or you can subscribe in iTunes. And also along the podcast lines, before I forget, I want to plug the most recent episode of Craft Beer Radio. Jeff and Greg were invited to tour an Anheuser-Busch malting facility in Idaho a couple weeks ago. And they got to see the barley in the field, and they got to follow it through the process of becoming malt. Sadly, after that, it became yellow fizzy stuff, but that's beside the point. I kid the big brewers. I kid. There's a lot of good information there on that episode and good background on what we're putting in our mash tuns. So check out craftbeerradio.com or find them in iTunes. Taking a look in the mailbag, there were a couple of questions regarding how to determine the alpha acid content of homegrown hops. It's that time of year. The brewers are picking their hops and saying, well, now what? I got these hops that I don't know what they are alpha acid-wise, but maybe you don't have to worry. Here's some experience and advice from Don up in St. Paul. I started growing hops 3 years ago, and I've always heard it said that homegrown hops work best for flavor and aroma. It almost seems that there's an unspoken ban on using them for bittering simply because you do not know how much bitterness they would contribute. Well, Don says, I set out to take on this challenge, and I also decided to make it an all-organic beer by using organic malt. I'm pleased to say that the results are excellent. The beer does have some hop bitterness, so I know the homegrown hops, quote-unquote, work. I first wort hopped the beer and added them throughout the boil. Homegrown hops provide a more earthy flavor, Don says, that isn't better or worse than commercial hops, just different. He says, anyway, no one should fear making an all-homegrown hop beer. Give it a try. You might be surprised. Well, last year, if you've been listening to the podcast, you might remember I made my harvest ale using my own hops for flavoring and aroma, and I used commercial hops for bittering because I didn't know what to expect from my homegrown hops, and I wanted to measure the bitterness, more accurately with the commercial examples. Well, this year I went for it and used all homegrown hops for my harvest ale, and you know what? It turned out just great. So it's a little less bitter than what I like, but my taste buds are pretty much blown anyway, so that may just be me. What I did was I used the standard range of expectation for alpha acid content for Cascade, which is what I harvested from my little hop trellis. And using that gauge as a guide, I got pretty close to what I was shooting for. Now, of course, if you're not sure you want to use your hops for a full batch at first, you can always do a small batch as an experiment and then check out the bitterness that way and scale up. By the way, I didn't get what I would call an earthy flavor, like Don said. I think Don and I are working off different definitions of earthy. But check out your own hops. Just go for it. Use your own hops and and to make your home brew and enjoy them. And let me know what you think. We're still getting a response from the show on marketing, quote-unquote, marketing homebrew to your friends and family. John in Mountain View, California writes, I enjoyed your show on marketing homebrew to friends and family. I had wanted to brew my own for about 10 years, but didn't, because all I ever heard and read was sterilization and contamination and bacteria. Well, finally, with the push of my wife, what a lucky guy John has, or is, for having a wife who would push him into homebrewing. Finally, with the push of my wife, I have been brewing and experimenting some very tasty beers for the last 2 years. Now that I understand that sterilization is to prevent off flavors and that contamination and bacteria at most make a funky beer without sickness or death. Hearing those words, sterilization, contamination, and bacteria, would prevent anyone from drinking anything we homebrewers create. Maybe you can explain how the beer is made without the use of these words. That's a great point, John. You know, if you remember from that episode that we're talking about, I committed a similar sin when I mentioned the word infection to Bob and James on that show, and you should have seen their faces. And you heard the reaction to that word. So I guess we can keep it positive by saying that, you know, if I put on my corporate marketing speak, we take care in maintaining the flavor of our beer by using quality control methods that are similar to what professional brewers use. You know, if we're asked to elaborate, we can just say that we keep our equipment very clean. So maybe that would work. Don't have to mention sterilization, contamination, and bacteria. I wouldn't want to eat that either. Then there's this from Travis in Syracuse, New York. When you guys were talking about the labeling of beer and how homebrewers might be able to present their creations in a favorable light, two things came to me. Number one, ABV, or alcohol by volume. Maybe it's because I'm a little younger, but all my friends can always rattle off the ABV of my brews. Seems to be a source of pride or a challenge to offer a beer that's a little stronger. This might be a great way to introduce them to good beer, noting nothing more convincing than a challenge to one's drinking prowess. There you go. As long as it's not combined with a challenge to one's driving prowess. Number two, the name. Travis says, I take a lot of time to name my brews, mostly for the fun of it, and I will notice people perk up and get a little intrigued when I have a witty name for my brew. For example, I named my mead a meth. That's a metheglin. That's a mead made with spices and herbs. I named my mead a meth after my wife, Krista. Now everyone is always asking about when my Krista meth is going to be ready. Travis says, I've noticed that people respond better to names like Moose Drool rather than American Brown Ale. Good point. That's part of the marketing process there. Paul writes in from Longmont, Colorado, which he says is near Lyons, which is home of Dale's Pale Ale and Oscar Blues and all that. Jealous. This year I decided I would not drink a beer unless I made a label for it, Paul says. What I do is design the label, then I go online and upload my file to my grocery store's website, where they print the file within an hour. I believe I designed the labels 3.5 inches by 5 inches. I then pick up the prints. I think they're 20 cents a piece, and I spray mount them on vent magnets that I get from Home Depot. They sell for $5, and there are 3 in a pack. Paul says the magnets are used to block air vents in your house. I use a box cutter to cut out the labels from the magnets. I put these magnets on the refrigerator. Works great, looks great, and is a great conversation piece. Very clever. You know, Paul and Bob are on the same wavelength there. You remember Bob Corskadden suggested putting some sort of a point-of-sale material on the fridge, and this sounds like a great way to do that without having to scrub bottles. Chris from Haverford, Pennsylvania writes, regarding your episode on marketing homebrew, In my experience, people are a lot more likely to be interested in homebrew if they're already interested in good beer in general. One of the best beers for doing this is the beer that started the American craft brewing movement, Anchor Steam. It's close enough to the typical lager to make it non-threatening, but flavorful and different enough to spark interest. Once your friends are used to drinking something that's not exactly a standard American lager, you can move on from there. That's good advice, too. Thanks, Chris. That episode was one of those episodes where I didn't know how it was going to be received. It's more philosophical than technical, I guess you'd say. But judging from the email, it went over pretty well. Appreciate all the input. Okay, on to the meat of the matter for this week. Michael Tonsmeire has been on the podcast a couple of times in the past. The first time was to sample his experiment in making single-hopped ales with American hops and then comparing them side by side. That was a tasty one. Then Mike made a similar experiment using different sugars in Belgian beers. That was also very tasty. And now he's been playing with bugs other than the standard beer yeasts, and he's generously sent us samples of what he's been doing. Michael Tonsmeire, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you, James, for having me on once again.
And in the studio, we have Steve Wilkes.
Hi, James. It's good to be back. And Mike, it's good to hear from you again.
And Mark Smith.
Nice to be back, James. Nice to meet you, Michael.
And Andy Sparks.
It's nice to be here.
Now, the umbrella for this series of two shows is brewing with non-traditional yeast. And by the number of beers that you sent us, Mike, you've been doing a lot of playing lately, haven't you?
No, I certainly have. Over the last maybe 9 months, I started brewing with Brettanomyces, and it moved into playing around with bread yeast and kombucha cultures and some other interesting stuff that hopefully is going to be really interesting, but we'll see.
And you have a blog, and you're known as the Mad
Fermentationist.
Ah, okay. And I'll put a link to your blog on our website at basicbrewingradio.com. Just look in this episode, and I'll link to your blog. But you're prolific, to say the least.
I'm not sure that's accurate, but I certainly do my best to put up just about every crazy thing I can figure out how to do in a two-bedroom apartment on there. So,
brewing-wise, anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell us about the first beer. This is a Kvass brewed with Yeast 1056.
I brewed a set of two, and we'll be drinking them both tonight. One with just regular 1056, so American ale yeast. I figure that'd be sort of a good control. And then one with Red Star active dry bread yeast.
And give us a background on what is a Kvass?
Sure. This is I'm calling this a neo Kvass. It's actually based on a recipe that a little microbrewery in Pittsburgh called East End did. A couple of times they have a series of session beers, and this was one of them. And the former head brewer at Heavyweight helped out. I guess he'd done some stuff with bread yeast right before Heavyweight closed down. If anyone doesn't know, Heavyweight was a great brewery in New Jersey that closed down about a year ago. They just did all sorts of amazing small batches and weird beers and weird yeast. And I guess they're looking to open up a brew pub, but that's sort of beside the point. This beer was made in a slightly higher gravity than traditional Kvass. Kvass is traditionally made with just stale bread that they soak in water and then ferment. And that yields a beer of about 1% alcohol. For this one, I used sort of about, I believe, a half gallon in a 2-gallon bag of this stale rye bread that had soaked in some 170-degree water for about 12 hours. And then I supplemented that with a mash of pale malts, brown malts, and some rye malt. So the rye malt sort of complementing the rye bread that was used. And I hopped it with about 10 IBUs of Czech Saz or Zatz hops, however you want to say it.
So it's a mild beverage.
Yes, it's this one came out to be about 3.5% alcohol, I believe.
And if you're a listener to Craft Beer Radio, he has talked about Jeff and Greg have talked about East End and their Kvass. And I believe they've done 2 batches of Kvass from listening to the show.
And last I heard, there was some rumor going around they'd be working on an Imperial Kvass at some point.
In the traditional American tradition.
Exactly.
So let's taste and see what we think. I'm not getting a whole lot in the nose.
Well, definitely like a yeasty character.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of a sourness. I'm detecting a little bit of a sourness in the nose.
That might come. So the bread steeped for about 12 hours. So there certainly could have been, without being pasteurized or boiled, there certainly could have been a little bit of wild yeast or bacteria activity in that time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually, this is not one of the ones I was more excited about trying tonight, and it's actually, pretty good. It's not what I drink every day, but it's nice, and it's not very strong, so it's kind of light.
Yeah. I would think I would classify this as a kind of a dinner beer, maybe. If you're having a dinner and you're just wanting something light with dinner. What do you think, Steve?
Tastes like bread. I taste
Very bready.
It's very
I can
bready
taste
to me.
the rye in it, though. It's interesting. I think it comes through strong.
Yeah, I used, it was a loaf of, just from my local Whole Foods, I think it was called Organic Jewish Rye, and I let it sit around at room temperature for about a week before breaking it up and using it. And I'm unclear every recipe I see for Kvass either says to let the bread get stale or toast it.
Huh.
And I have no idea why. I haven't even read a theory about why that's necessary, except that it's traditional you'd use the stale bread sort of as an economic stretcher that bread would get stale, and this would be a way to use it.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of just a light wheat beer with a little bit more, for lack of a better word, staleness. It just a little bit of stale bread, but it reminds me very much of drinking just somebody's kind of mild wheat beer,
Or like a Belgian vet beer.
Yeah. Good,
yeah.
But better.
But yeah.
And it does have that very hazy look like a white beer would have.
Yeah, I guess what you say is very pale and yellow. What are the challenges?
Good head retention as well. Surprisingly, something that had some bread in it.
Well, we only poured a quarter of a bottle each, so I don't know that we had an opportunity to get much head. But
there is, a layer of head on everybody's glass. It's
yeah. Now, what are the challenges in brewing a Kvass? And if someone's going to try it, how would they do it?
One of the most interesting things I found, I actually sent an email to the head brewer. I believe still the only employee, maybe one of 2 employees at East End. Before I brewed in, I actually ended up brewing it before he got back to me. He told me that for his 15-barrel batch, he pitched 2 tablespoons of bread yeast, and which is just, a laughably small amount if you're thinking in terms of how much you'd normally pitch gallons of yeast slurry, and this was just, I guess, right out of the package, rehydrated and tossed in there. I ended up using. Let me check my notes here for a second. I used about, I think, 1 gram of bread yeast in 2 gallons, and that turned out to be, I think, about 25 times more proportional yeast than he used.
So this is just a 2-gallon batch.
Exactly, just a 2-gallon batch. And he was telling me that his beer, it took off so violently that he came in the next morning and it was up to 80 degrees already, just naturally of its own heat. And so I guess I was lucky and I kept mine in my temperature controlled fridge. And I think I didn't like it above 70. So I'm not sure if that would have, given it more character, I assume, but I'm not sure if it would have been a better character or what. The other major challenge was just dealing with this huge mass of soggy bread.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you think of what you would predict to be a sticky mash, soggy bread, it seems to me would just be a big sponge.
And so what I ended up doing with that is I made the beer and sort of the bread juice, I'm calling it, completely separately, and then dumped the half gallon of strain. So I took the bread and I strained it through a metal strainer, and I add that with about a minute to go in the boil. So it's just sort of this pale yellow, hazy, starchy liquid got dumped in.
Huh. So into the boil.
Right into the boil.
Huh.
So it got no conversion other than what it was going to do itself. It didn't get affected by the enzymes in the malt.
So it's almost like an adjunct rather than a fermentable, I guess you'd say.
Yes, but I mean, as the traditional kvass, I mean, is essentially just that bread juice, and it gets up to 1% alcohol. So there's something fermentable in there, and how it gets fermentable might have something to do with the staling. I actually don't know.
Well, that was that's actually, as it warmed up, it got more tasty to me, and at the very end, smelling it and tasting it, it reminded me a bit of, and I think it was Mark, you said the Belgian wit, and it reminded me more of Avery's White Rascal than anything else that I've had lately. Although it doesn't have the coriander and the citrus, but there's that base of kind of funkiness in there in the beer. I think it's very tasty.
You know, I'm surprised it kind of grew on me. My first taste, I was kind of, I don't know, but, third or fourth taste, and I was kind of digging it.
Yeah. Very drinkable.
We'll see how the bread yeast one goes over with you.
Unfortunately, we only had 3 or 4 sips out of the... Well, there's a little bit left, and Andy's going to take it.
No, and it's pretty yeasty, so... Anybody else want a little...
No, I'm good.
Want a little extra carbonation tonight?
Yeah, that's a tasty little beer.
Yeah, thank you. And it was a very short boil. I think I only gave it a half an hour boil anyway, so it was a fast beer to make.
Oh, wow. Huh. Okay, so now we go into the... this is the Kvass with the Red Star Active Dry Bread Yeast.
Yeah.
So give us a story behind that one.
Yummy.
So this one was made at exactly the same time, much like the other experiments I've done on the show previously. It was just split into 2 1-gallon jugs, and one got the 1056 and one got the bread yeast.
Oh, I see. So the same wort.
Exactly.
Split.
And watch out, this one is a bit more carbonated. When I balled it, this one was down to 1012. The 1056 was down to 1009. And I think this one, I haven't done a hydrometer reading, but I think this one may have dropped another point or 2 in the bottle.
Now, this just reminds me of, is this how they make beer in prison? With bread and yeast.
Packets of sugar.
I believe you're pretty close.
Yeah. Actually, this is pretty good.
But, that's just the process, not the product.
Yeah.
Right.
I was surprised. I was expecting this to be more yeasty and almost an objectionable yeasty character to the nose, and it's not really. It's pretty clean. Yeah.
This one, I was actually really concerned. When I started fermenting it the first couple of days, it smelled awful. Well, no, the first day it smelled great. It smelled like, rising bread. I was going, this is going to be great. It's going to, taste like, rising bread, fresh bread. And then went through this awful sort of sulfurous, yeasty, just objectionable, 2 or 3 days. And then I guess that must have blown away, and it turned out fine.
It's surprisingly similar to the first beer. If you're tasting these side by side, it would be difficult to pick out the one fermented with the bread yeast and the one fermented with the 1056.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, this has more of a kind of a bright Belgian-y character to it.
I've always thought this one tasted a little bit Belgian, maybe a little phenolic, a little bit fruitier than the other one,
but a little drier too.
Yeah.
And a little richer to me. The flavor's richer somehow.
I haven't tasted it yet, but it smells. I had a New Belgian triple last night, and it smells a whole lot like the triple. It smells almost exactly like the triple, in fact.
Certainly hazier than the other one. This one is almost translucent but not transparent. With the other one, I feel like you could see through a little bit better.
And it is very dry. And you're right, Andy. This is much drier than the first one. Drier in taste, at least.
Both of these only end up, at least when I bottle them, at about 75% attenuation. But I think the fact that they start around 1035 means that, even 75% attenuation gets them really dry.
I'm really enjoying this.
Yeah, I think I like the first one better. Maybe
really?
A little less dry, a little more mouthfeel. This one's a little, it's very bubbly and very dry.
Now, how much bread yeast did you use on this one?
I believe I used. I think it was 1 gram. But I'll double check that and make sure that's correct.
And did you rehydrate or hydrate the yeast, or did you treat it in any special way?
I was lazy. I just tossed it right in.
Good for you. No, this is tasty. I'm really enjoying this beer. I mean, Steve and I are looking for session beers, and this is it's well carbonated. It's got, even though it's dry, it's got a good mouthfeel. It's bright. It's got that kind of funky sort of Belgian-y, overtones in the aroma that I like.
And bread yeast you can really only use in a session beer. From my understanding, it may differ brand to brand, but it's only got about 5% alcohol tolerance. So you might be able to start a bigger beer with it and then have to finish with maybe a neutral yeast, something like that.
So why do we think this one finished drier? This one,
it's strange. It actually finished sweeter when I was bottling it. It was about 3 points higher. It may just be that the bread yeast. I'm not sure if it's drier now or it's just the higher carbonation makes it seem drier. Or
this is bottle condition. Is that correct?
Yes.
Huh. So it changed a little bit since then.
Right. It could be a little bit not over-carbonated, but it's more carbonated than the last one, so it may have done a little bit more fermentation in the bottle than the last.
Yeah. Be interesting over time. How long has this been in the bottle?
I bottled this, I brewed it right at the beginning of July, and I probably bottled it near the end of July. So probably a month and a half.
Well, that's very nice.
It really is. The flavor that keeps coming back to me, or what it reminds me of, is champagne that has a kind of biscuity, yeasty finish to it, and I don't know, it just reminds me of that quite a lot. It's good.
Excellent.
I think it's interesting that we've all compared it to white beer, Belgian wits, which are typically, made with like a raw winter wheat, which gives it that white, starchy look. And this is kind of an interesting way of making maybe a white beer for an extract brewer, because you could use this kind of technique to get some starch into your batch and then, finish it off with, a normal extract batch, because it'd give you that haziness and that whiteness that you're looking for.
That's an excellent point. So where do we go next, Mike?
I guess we're going to the Flanders Reds.
So this next beer, Mike, is a Flanders Red made with and we're pronouncing it kombucha culture. First of all, give us some background on what kombucha is.
So last November, I was out in Denver for a couple of weeks on the job training for my job with the government, and I was bored. I didn't know anyone in Denver. Essentially, I had a long lost cousin out there that I met. But other than that, I just sort of had a lot of free time, and one of the things I did was I would go to a local supermarket or a local Whole Foods or a local co-op and just see sort of what sorts of interesting food products they had that I hadn't seen before, being 2,000 miles away. And one thing I picked up was a couple bottles of it's a fermented Chinese tea called kombucha, which is fermented with just this sort of disc, gelatinous disc of all sorts of microbes and yeast and bacteria and all sorts of stuff. And a couple of them weren't very good. They just sort of tasted like carbonated vinegar, essentially, carbonated watered-down vinegar. I had one great one. I'll pull up the name. I think it was called Tea Tree, I believe. And it was it tasted like a low-alcohol Russian River wild beer. I mean, big Brettanomyces nose, really, really tasty. And so I brought a bottle of this back with me, and I cultured up the live culture that was in there, and I've kept it going now for almost a year. Just sort of every couple of weeks, I'll bottle a batch, and I'll pour in some sweetened tea, essentially.
And this thing looks like a kind of a cross between a jellyfish and a lily pad or something, right? Just this gelatinous mass.
It's the sort of thing that's out on the dining room table, and my roommate wants me to put away whenever anyone's coming over for fear that they will not stay.
They sell this, and I won't try to pronounce it. How do you pronounce it? Kombucha. They sell it at our natural food store, and I tried a bottle of it just a couple 3 months ago, and I couldn't get through the bottle. It was not tasty to me.
You had a bad one.
I had a bad one. I didn't even know there were different kinds. So I don't know.
I think it's sort of the same way that everyone just has their own house culture, and some of them are more acidic, and some of them are funkier, and some of them are cleaner. But it seems to be getting they're now selling it around D.C. It's very popular with people who think that eating live bacteria is good for the digestive system or good for the body.
That's what I thought.
So give us a background on this beer that Andy is about to open and pour.
So this one, I have not tried this yet. Every batch makes 2 bottles, so this is a whole batch that we're about to open.
Oh, my.
But it was made, instead of regular sugar, I used malt extract, and I steeped a little bit of a couple different specialty grains, a little Cara Vienna, Cara Munich, and Cara Aroma. Cara Aroma is similar to a Special B. I think it's just a different manufacturer's brand name. How is it? Carbonated?
Well, the nose hit me like vinegar.
Yeah.
So did you try to carbonate this, or it's pretty flat?
Oh man, it is pretty flat. I add some sugar in there, and it must not have taken.
Wow, that's pungent.
Interesting.
If I had some cucumbers and some onions, I'd pour it over it.
It would make a nice dressing.
That's what I'm saying.
Woo!
Wow.
Interesting. It is, sour.
Extremely sour.
Oh, well, I wouldn't say it's as sour as like a bottle of La Folie or something.
It's in the same ballpark.
Yeah, it's acidic. It's
and it has that same vinegar character that I don't get in every Flanders Red, but I get in La Folie and I get in a couple other ones.
Yeah.
Huh.
And it has a little of that barnyard funkiness in the nose.
Yeah.
Horse blanket, definitely.
Well, yeah, and it's almost
like
on the floor of the bar.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The blanket's been drinking.
It's county fair.
But it's one of those things. It's like you keep smelling it. Interesting.
I actually think it tastes relatively similar to a Flanders Red. I mean, not spot on, but
yeah,
Steve's
taking
I made
a pass.
this about a month ago, so it's definitely a lot faster.
Steve has taken a pass.
I couldn't do it.
And it's doesn't have a lot of body, so it's pretty thin. Which tends to put that.
I think the original gravity on this was in the 120s, and the 1020s.
It tastes better than it smells. There's no doubt.
Yeah, but I got to tell you, I got to be honest. And you wanted it. You sent an email saying that you wanted our honest feedback. This is a bit even too sour for me, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
now that's saying something there.
I can imagine this being pleasant in little tiny nip bottles being split with someone.
Yeah. Kind of like this.
Exactly.
Well, I was actually thinking that it might be something that you might be able to blend with some other beer and get a little sourness from it, but that's about my level of...
And we'll see, because my traditional real Flanders Red that we're trying next, I think, is not sour enough.
Oh,
Oh.
a little of this in there. Oh.
Exactly. So you might want to save some of this and see how it is.
And I'm kind of thinking that if this had more body, more dextrins in it, add a little sweetness to balance out the acidity, it would be pretty neat beer.
Yeah.
Whereas this is a little thin and a little sour, and so it leaves it a little crisp in the back of your throat. Ooh, and I got that little funk.
Yeah, it does have, when you swirl it up, it does.
I'm telling you, there's boll weevil crawling all over that.
It does. Yeah, there's a fertilizer factor there.
Let's move on.
So yeah, we'll
Let's rinse.
We'll rinse, and we will move on to the Flanders Red.
Okay.
Very cool. Here we go.
Okay, we're popping the top on your Flanders Red. So tell us about this one.
This one was brewed last August, so it's just a little bit more than maybe 13 months old now. And this one was brewed, started with White Labs 530, which is the Westmalt strain. And then I pitched the Yeast Roselier blend, which is the combination of all sorts of stuff, including various lactic acid bacteria, Brettanomyces, I believe maybe even sherry floors in there. And then that aged for about a year until I bottled it about a month ago now. And it had something I learned about on the Raj Apta podcast, the chair leg that was toasted and then inserted into the neck of the carboy.
Yeah, I got an email today, in fact, from someone who said, "Has anybody ever used that peg idea from Raj?" And I said, "Well, I think Michael Tonsmeire's done it, so I'll ask him about it." So what did you think about that experience?
I have two beers. I did this one and a lambic, and the problem I found with it is that the wood expanded and actually cracked the neck of my carboy.
Oh no!
And luckily it just sort of cracked the neck and nothing bad happened. I ended up leaving it in there, and I think the beer turned out well. So not a major deal. But I just started another batch, and I think I've sort of made hopefully an improvement to the system. I just took a better bottle and I used this sort of much larger than a regular neck of a carboy stopper, and I drilled a bigger hole in that to put the peg through, and then I drilled another smaller hole and put an airlock in that.
Huh.
So now there's a way for excess fermentation to get out, which was another problem with the original system. The pressure sometimes would be unequal, and it would build up and force some beer out sort of through the wood.
Oh, so it wasn't taking air in; it was pushing beer out.
Exactly, and that was only at the beginning when sort of the various cultures were sort of kicking into gear. But it still required sort of daily cleanup, and I was concerned about at one point there was some mold growing that I hadn't spotted, where some beer leaked out. So if you're really sort of studious, it's a fine plan. The big disadvantage of the better bottles, I have no idea what the oxygen transfer rate of that stuff is, and it's certainly higher than glass. How much higher, I don't know, but we'll see on this next batch, which will be done in another year and a half or so.
Well, this is a very tasty beer. This is much more enjoyable than the previous. Much better balanced. There is some sourness, but I think you say it's maybe not enough sourness for your palate, but I think it's certainly enough to give it a bite.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, certainly.
This is definitely a case of less is more.
Mm.
It's less sour and it's more drinkable to me. It might be a little thin. I don't know. I want some more body in it myself.
This one went all the way from 1064 down to 1009.
Mm.
Yeah. Wow.
I detect the same thinness.
Mm.
The problem with not kegging or pasteurizing the beer is that you can't back sweeten like most commercial Flanders Red brewers do. They pasteurize, they sweeten it, and then they force carbon and bottle. Where in this case, the option would be to get a little squirt bottle of simple syrup, or some combination of simple syrup and maltodextrin, and then just add to the bottle whenever you want to drink some.
Just at serving time, sweeten it up a little bit.
Exactly.
Well, I would drink it as is. I think it's
It's certainly very drinkable, and with a German meal, some sauerkraut and pork going on there, and it'd be good.
The second half of this, I bottled half the batch. The second half, second 2.5 gallons, got 4 pounds of blackberries. And it's still aging at the moment. So I'm hoping that gets a little more sour. Maybe the wild yeast on the fruit will sort of kick the whole beer into another sour realm.
So which one, Andy? Which one is the bottle with the kombucha mother in it? It was just the previous one, the really sour one.
Just
is this
smell
the
it.
one? Oh, that's the one. I'm gonna pour some. Do a little blend. Just a splash of the kombucha. Oh.
Doing a little blending.
Whew. Maybe a little too much, but actually, that adds a lot of complexity to the Flanders Red. Just a bit of a splash of that in there, and it's tasty.
I think that's the answer to a lot of these sour beer brewing, adventures is to, have a couple of different versions lying around that you can, mix a little the too sour one into the not sour enough one, and get the blend you're looking for, because it's almost impossible, to hit all of these different components from just one batch. The right flavor, the right sourness, the right body, the right everything.
Well, that's what they do with La Folie is, they do the blending with several of the different batches.
Sadly, most of us don't have trained tasting panels to help us choose the blend.
Or giant fooders full of sour beers in various stages of fermentation. But that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, both of just the mixture of the two. It's a taste treat. My wife would hate it. She doesn't like the sour beers and doesn't understand why we do.
Yes, I once in a while give various people taste of this one, and I get a lot of, oof, whoa.
Well, you're expanding people's horizons.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. So the last beer in this show will be the strong dark Belgian with sweet cherries, bourbon oak, Brettanomyces C, and Orval dregs,
which contain Brett B. So it's got hopefully 2 kinds of Brett and a whole lot of flavor.
This is what I've been looking forward to since I learned of this show. I'm really looking forward to this beer.
So this is loosely, or probably more than loosely, based on a beer Pizza Port now the Lost Abbey does, called Cuvée Tommy, which is a similar beer. They use sour cherries, and I believe their base beer is different, but it's certainly inspired by.
So talk about your brewing process with this beer.
So this one I brewed about I think the original gravity was around 1095. Belgian strong dark, mostly base malt, but with a little bit of dark malt, a good deal of caramel malts, and pretty low hopping. And then I transferred it with, I believe, half an ounce of American oak that I charred with a blowtorch and soaked in Elijah Craig bourbon, and 6 pounds in a 3-gallon batch of fresh, and then I froze them for about 2 days just to break up the cell walls. Dark sweet cherries, and then a small starter of a combination of Orval dregs and Brett C.
Now, how much of the Orval dregs did you use?
I believe it was 2 balls worth that were put into the starter with the Brett C.
And how big of a starter did you start with?
It was a pretty small starter. It was probably only about a cup. I just because this one was then aged for about 9 months before bottling, so the Brett had plenty of time and plenty of food to eat.
Yeah,
particularly the cherries added.
I tried to do a starter with Orval dregs, and I think my mistake was that I pitched the dregs into too big of a starter. I think I might have even used like a quart or something, and nothing happened. And I think it was just overwhelming, maybe for the for the little buggies in the bottom of the Orval bottle.
Brett can be also. It's strange, and we'll talk about this on the next show. But it's a very unusual. You can't think of it just like another yeast. Sometimes it likes to work really slowly, and sometimes it works just as fast, if not faster, than regular Saccharomyces. That all depends on a whole number of conditions that we'll get into later.
Wow, no, that's a complex beer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's wow. That's not your PBR there. Wow, there's very oaky, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's.
You can taste the bourbon in it.
Yeah, I was going to say there's the whiskey.
Yep. I get almost like chocolate-like flavors.
I get chocolate. I even get a little coffee.
That's probably the dark roasted malts, and a lot of people sort of have different feelings on whether or not those have any place in Belgian beers. This one didn't have much. It had 1% chocolate malt, so not much.
I think this is delicious.
Yeah, I'm getting and I don't know if this is just me, but is the mouthfeel kind of slick a little bit? Is that a descriptor, or maybe it's just all the other bugs that I've been tasting this evening?
It's a fairly strong beer, there's no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Very complex, like you mentioned.
Would anyone like to take a guess at the final gravity? It started at 1095 and had 2 pounds of cherries per gallon added.
No idea.
Maybe 10%.
Yeah,
It's very alcoholic.
yeah.
It finished below 110. It was at 1009.
Wow. So what does that make the ABV?
I think it's up near 11, almost 11 and a half.
Mm-hmm. But it's drinkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't taste intensely alcoholic. I mean, you can tell that it has a lot of, alcohol in it.
There's a heat in my throat after I've drank it a little bit. And it's not a beer that I would pour a pint of, but I would pour a small snifter, and I would have it with dessert, or I might have it with some smoked duck. Would be really good with this.
Well, it's interesting it's so high in alcohol, it really doesn't have the legs that you would see with this.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's because it's so well attenuated. I mean, it's up near almost 90% attenuation. I think some of that legs, and I'm not completely clear on the physics, but is due to residual sugar.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
That would make sense. Very nice.
If this was served cold, you wouldn't be able to tell how strong it was at all.
So how much of this did you make?
There's 3 gallons of it floating around, and I think I bottled it maybe 3 months ago, and maybe I've opened a 6-pack. So there's probably still a case in circulation.
Wow. It'd be interesting to revisit this, in a year or, more to see what happens.
It's already gotten much smoother and much less funky than originally. It was very funky. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if it's just that we've been drinking, what we've been drinking before this one, but it's a little barnyardy, but not much.
Mm-hmm.
The finishes, to me, in the middle I get the cherries and I get a kind of smoothness, but when I'm done with it, there's kind of a rawness in my throat from it, and it's a little funky at the end.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit of the barnyard in the nose, but it's not nearly as overpowering as the kombucha.
This is very civilized.
Mm-hmm.
So this one was really just sort of one of those recipes where you're almost embarrassed to tell, people who brew how many ingredients are in it, and I think it's something like 8 malts and 4 different sugars and 3 different yeast and cherries and bourbon. It's just one of those recipes that you're almost ashamed to because I'm normally a person who says simpler is better. Try the simple recipe, and this one certainly flies in the face of that.
Well, I, for one, am glad you did.
This really reminds me of that, was it the Sam Adams Triple Bock that they had a few years ago in those small bottles? Does anybody remember that? This reminds me of that.
It was a much thicker beer.
Oh, yeah, that was a much heavier beer. But
this
there's
is
still
as complex as.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah,
But it didn't have the funkiness, because
No,
that didn't
that's
have
true.
any bread in it.
right.
That's true. But it is as complex and probably well-crafted a beer as that one.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, James.
No, it's well done.
Excellent.
So thank you, Michael, for sending these beers, and we're only halfway done. In next week's show, more beers. And next week we will explore more of the Brettanomyces. So we can't wait. Thanks, Mike.
No problem, James.
Well, thanks again to Mike Tonsmeire. You can find a link to his blog in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. Well, next week, and also thanks to Andy and Steve and Mark for helping to drink the beers. You know, it's tough work. Next week, we continue our sampling with beers fermented with Brettanomyces. Different strains, different methods, different beers. Lots of fun. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop, where you can find great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. We take you through infusion mashing and step mashing and fly sparging and batch sparging and do it all in kind of a non-linear way. So, and also, still, we're getting closer to finishing up the third DVD. Just a little teaser there. You can see listening the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. Remember our shirts and hats, including our ever-popular Go Forth and Flocculate shirt. And if you take a picture of yourself in a cool place wearing one of our shirts, send it to me and I'll put it in our gallery online. Thanks to everybody also who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are I'm Just Here for More Food. Food times mixing plus heat equals baking. And the Kodak EasyShare Printer Dock Series 3. Maybe it's Printer Dock Series 3. Anyway. Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we'll get a little slice of that. We appreciate your support. That's all until next week. Till then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dotson in Austin, who also did our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.